We're going to begin tonight, though, with a deep dive into a case heading to the Supreme Court, in fact, tomorrow, and it has to do with gun ownership.
Yeah, a lot of interest in this. We want to tell you this case goes all the way back to 1994 when Congress passed a law that prohibits people that are facing domestic violence restraining orders from having guns. Now, a Texas man, his name is Zackey Rahimi, challenged the law after he was indicted by a grand jury, and that came after police say he was involved in 5 shootings in and around Arlington. That was in 2020 and the start of 2021. Now, police say he admitted he was the subject of a domestic violence restraining order that prohibited gun possession.
And that restraining order that Nicole talks about was issued after a pretty violent confrontation that was documented with his girlfriend in Arlington. Even then, an appeals court judge said that the law at issue could not be justified by looking to history. And the court ruled in Rahimi's favor. So now, basically, here we sit on the precipice of the Supreme Court weighing in for a final decision. So here is where we want to bring our guest into the discussion tonight. Natalie Nanasi is joining us from SMU's Dedman School of Law. Thank you for being here tonight. Also from the founding director, I should say, of the Judge Elmo B. Hunter Legal Center for Victims of Crimes Against Women.
Yes, all the credentials we need to discuss a topic like this. And I want to start, Natalie, by just kind of laying the context and the history of this case for folks who don't really understand why this is such a big deal.
Yeah, so you said this goes back to 1994, which is absolutely the case. After that, a really important point in history to think about is actually just last year when the Supreme Court changed the way that Second Amendment cases are analyzed across the country. What used to happen is a balancing of the government's interest in protection and the burden it would place on the Second Amendment. What the court ruled last year in a case called Bruin is that there'd be a new test, and it would be whether or not the modern day regulation had a basis in the history and tradition of regulation of firearms.
And the Bruin test from last year is yet another point of contention, you know, when we come to this boiling pot of how far back can we go, what can we use from history to kind of truly carve a path forward, right?
Right.
This is not easy stuff.
No. It's not. And if you think about it, back in 1791, when the Second Amendment was ratified, the world looked so different for women, right? Domestic violence wasn't a problem that people were thinking.
Was that even a term then?
It was
probably not,
term,
right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, women were considered property of their husbands. Women weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to be in the workplace. And domestic violence was something that people just thought was an acceptable thing.
I want to touch on that because when we talk about domestic violence, I think a lot of people hear that and go, there should be no question about people who are subject to these restraining orders not being able to get guns. But they argued that, Rahimi argued that, and the court sided with him, which is why now it's going to the Supreme Court. 2 guns were found when there was a search warrant executed on his property. Again, multiple incidents of him in Arlington firing guns allegedly in public. What do you say to people who think, or what's your opinion on the context of this law, Second Amendment law, being used for the context of domestic violence victims?
Well, I mean, certainly, as you can see, and Mr. Rahimi is a perfect example, is that somebody who is committing the type of violence that he was against his intimate partner is also a risk to the community at large. You mentioned he was shooting guns in public. He was doing that while there were children right there on the street with him. He was shooting off guns in places where we are just very lucky, and the judge in one of his cases said this, that it's a miracle that nobody else was injured. Mm-hmm.
Now, we talked about before we came out, wasn't there a Times article that dropped, was it today or yesterday? Mm-hmm. Rahimi is on record via the Times at least saying, you know what, I'm kind of done with this. I don't want to be involved.
Yeah.
We're way too late on that, right? Yeah. He has no more choice in that. Unlike any other possible court proceeding, this is a different deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, this case is now the one that's working its way, has worked its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to make a decision on it. The Fifth Circuit was actually the very first federal court in the country to overturn a gun regulation based on that Bruin decision. And so now the Supreme Court has an opportunity to clarify exactly what it meant, to your question earlier. What does it mean to look back to history, right? Are we trying to find an exact statute? So again, a statute from the 18th century that prohibits domestic violence offenders with protective orders against them from having guns? Or are we going to try to look at the purpose behind the regulation, right? Which is to prevent dangerous people from having guns. If that's the case, if the Supreme Court says, as I hope they will, in Rahimi, look, what we're looking for is the animating purpose, there's plenty of historical evidence that dangerous people for centuries have been prohibited from having guns.
I want to ask one quick question. You know, Solicitor General wrote on the opinion of Sotomayor's opinion on this and said that the difference between a battered woman and a dead woman is the presence of a gun, suggesting that the presence of a firearm could escalate a domestic violence situation. We also know that there have been 77,000 gun purchases prohibited, thank God, to the domestic violence people who are subject to restraining orders. Thank you to the National Background Program for that. What is your response to that? And how do you think that might indicate tomorrow's decision from the Supreme Court?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think anytime Justice Sotomayor says something, we ought to listen. And I think it's an absolutely wise point. I mean, it doesn't take any kind of rocket scientist or legal scholar to understand that when you have a gun in the hands of somebody who has already proven themselves to be willing to hurt somebody, that the presence of that gun is going to make that situation more dangerous for, again, not only their intimate partner, but for other people involved. And I think, you know, I hope and I think the Supreme Court will consider the impact of a decision that would allow domestic violence offenders to have guns, because it would just be, honestly, catastrophic for survivors and particularly women across the country.
Sure.
Yeah. Ultimately, and at the end of the day, any court, be it the Supreme Court or others, it is somewhat subjective in its interpretation. And we've got a big day ahead to hear what they have to say. And we may not hear, obviously, tomorrow, but the consideration begins tomorrow. All right. Natalie Nanasi from SMU Dedman School, thank you so much.
Yes, really good information.
Appreciate your time and
Thank
insight.
You.